You wake up cold. Not just a little chilly. No. You wake up medieval cold. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there like a vengeful ex. Your bed is made of straw, which sounds whimsical until you realize it's also home to approximately 7 different types of beetles and one confused mouse named Gerald. The blanket? Oh, that's not a blanket. It's a piece of itchy wool that smells faintly of damp sheep, regret, and the suspiciously unwashed monk who handed it to you the night before. Your nose is running. Not from illness, though statistically, you probably are ill, but from the absolute lack of insulation in this stone-walled cell the local priest has generously dubbed the pilgrim's resting room. And by resting room, he means small echo chamber of your own poor life choices. There's no sun yet. Just a vague blue-gray haze crawling across the narrow stained-glass window that depicts some saint being martyred in graphic detail. The colors are vivid. Reds, blues, a yellow that almost looks cheerful if you squint hard enough. But the image itself? A man with a face full of serene agony, being sawn in half by 2 dudes who look like they're having way too much fun. Welcome to the medieval church. It's 4:52 a.m. You have about 8 minutes before someone starts ringing a bell the size of a Volkswagen, and you're expected to shuffle into mass with a bunch of bleary-eyed monks who've already been awake since midnight. And yes, we're going to talk about the colors. That's why you're here, remember? Not to marvel at the comfortable poverty aesthetic of 13th century ecclesiastical living, but to learn about colors. Yes, colors, pigments, fabrics, liturgical vestments, the secret coded language of fabric dye. So before you roll yourself back into your blanket of goat-scented sadness, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's weirdly soothing to know some of you are drifting off in Tokyo while others are making cereal in Ohio. One world. One sleep-deprived history cult. Now, back to your miserable morning. You stand up. Slowly. Every joint pops like firewood in a damp hearth. Your feet hit the stone floor, no socks, of course, and it's like stepping onto a glacier. There's a jug of water nearby for washing, but you ignore it. You already tried it yesterday. It's colder than your social prospects in this century. You fumble for your robe, a coarse beige tunic that was probably white about 2 decades ago, and pull it over your head. It smells like incense and despair. Perfect. Ready for church. You shuffle down a narrow hallway lit only by a single candle at the far end. The church bell begins to toll, echoing through your chest like a medieval alarm clock built by someone who hated happiness. The monks are already lining up in silence, draped in heavy black robes with cowls that make them look like depressed wizards. No one speaks. That would be cheerful. And cheerfulness is not on the liturgical schedule today. Or any day. You step into the sanctuary and suddenly, despite everything, the cold, the silence, the mild spiritual dread, you notice something strange, color. It's not a riot of color, mind you. It's not a pride parade. It's subtle, reserved, intentional, but it's there. The priest, standing at the altar like the world's grumpiest fashion influencer, is dressed in a bright green chasuble. Not neon green, more like moss. A forest green that says, yes, I serve God, but I also care about seasonal aesthetics. Behind him, altar cloths in the same shade ripple gently in the drafty air. There's gold embroidery, a hint of red in the candle holders, and on the great stone wall behind him, a fresco that once might have been glorious, reds faded to rust, blues now somewhere between bruise and forget-me-not. And you wonder, because you've slept badly and your brain is starting to hallucinate minor historical epiphanies, what do these colors mean? Why green? Why not beige, like literally everything else in this place? Why does it seem like someone, somewhere, actually cared about making these specific choices? Welcome, dear viewer, to the surprisingly colorful world of medieval church services. Spoiler alert, it wasn't for fun. This isn't about expressing individual creativity or matching the altar cloths to the priest's eye color. No, this is medieval Europe. Nothing is for fun. Everything has rules. Complicated, theological, Latin-inscribed rules. Let's start with the basics. If you lived in medieval Europe, chances are you had a deeply complicated relationship with color. And by that, I mean you probably didn't see much of it. Your clothes? Brown. Or maybe gray. If you were lucky enough to afford different dirt. Your house? Mud. Your food? Also brown. Maybe beige, if it was moldy. The point is, color was expensive. Color was power. Color was theological. The church, being the largest and most terrifyingly well-organized institution in Europe outside of maybe the Black Death itself, understood this. So it used color with surgical precision. Every hue you saw during a service had a purpose, a meaning, a liturgical justification. Because heaven forbid someone wear the wrong vestment on the wrong saint's day. That kind of thing could trigger a spiritual meltdown. Or worse, a strongly worded letter from a bishop. Let's talk vestments. These are the religious garments worn by clergy during services. The outermost one, the star of the ecclesiastical fashion show, is the chasuble. Think poncho, but make it holy. It's big. It's flowing. It's often embroidered with gold thread donated, by pious nobles with guilt complexes the size of France. The color of the chasuble isn't chosen at random. No. It's dictated by the liturgical calendar, which is basically a giant mood ring for the church. Certain seasons, feasts, and fasts are associated with specific colors, each symbolizing something very specific and usually very depressing. Let's start with white. Yes. White, the color of purity, light, and not accidentally spilling red wine on your priest outfit. White was used for the big feel-good holidays, Christmas, Easter, and the feast days of non-martyred saints. You know, the saints who managed to make it through their entire holy careers without being set on fire, skinned alive, or creatively dismembered. It's also the color worn at weddings. Not because the bride is pure, but because the church likes consistency. Then there's red. Red is for martyrs, Pentecost, and feasts of the Holy Spirit. It's the color of blood, fire, and occasionally, high cholesterol. When you saw red in church, it meant someone either died spectacularly for their faith or the Holy Spirit was descending like a celestial arsonist. Either way, things were getting intense. Next up, green. The default. The beige of the liturgical spectrum. Green was used during ordinary time, which sounds relaxing, but was actually code for all the church days that aren't important enough for special colors. It symbolizes growth, hope, and the soul-crushing march of spiritual development. If red is fire and white is glory, green is spiritual broccoli. Purple, or violet, was the official color of Lent and Advent. 2 seasons of waiting, fasting, and generally being sad about sin. If you see a priest in purple, you know it's time to feel guilty. On purpose. For 40 days. While eating boiled roots and regretting your birth. And finally, black. Used for funerals and All Souls' Day. The color of mourning. Of ashes. Of please don't resurrect yourself like last time, Gerald. It was meant to remind you of death. As if the constant threat of plague and famine wasn't already doing a fantastic job. Some churches even used rose, yes, rose, for the 3rd Sunday of Advent and the 4th Sunday of Lent. A little pop of pastel in an otherwise grim season. Think of it as the church saying, hey, we know you've been sad for 3 weeks. Here's some cheerful pink before we go back to weeping about the crucifixion. And here's the wild part, these rules weren't always standardized. In the early medieval period, different regions did different things. Some churches used red where others used green. Some didn't bother with colors at all because they couldn't afford the dyes, or the priest was colorblind, or everyone had simply forgotten the rules due to an inconvenient Viking raid. But by the 12th century, the church had started cracking down. Liturgical colors became standardized, especially under Pope Innocent III, who, despite the cheerful name, was about as fun as a dry communion wafer. By his time, the color system had become codified, symbolic, and absolutely mandatory if you didn't want to go to hell for wearing the wrong shade of sorrow. And dye? Oh, dye was expensive. You think your custom-dyed tie-dye hoodie was pricey? Try getting your hands on Tyrian purple in medieval Europe. It was made from crushed sea snails, smelled like decomposing fish, and cost more than a decent horse. Only royalty and bishops could afford it. Which meant most vestments were dyed using cheaper options, woad for blue, madder for red, weld for yellow. If that sounds like plant-based suffering, it's because it was. So, the next time you walk into a medieval church, half asleep and spiritually unprepared, and you see the priest decked out like a very somber Christmas ornament, remember, he didn't just wake up and throw that on. That color was chosen, ordained, and possibly argued about in Latin for several hours by candlelight. It means something. Probably penance. Probably fire. Possibly sheep. And yes, you're still standing in the cold. But don't worry, we've only just scratched the surface. The bell rings again. Time for lauds. That's morning prayer, in case you weren't paying attention in Monk 101. The colors glow faintly in the torchlight. The service begins. And you, lucky you, are about to sit through 90 minutes of Gregorian chanting in a language you don't understand, while being subtly judged by a saint's eyeballs painted on the wall. It's going to be a long morning, and a long video. So stay warm, and let's keep going. You're still in church. Sorry. I wish I could say something exciting happened, like a spontaneous holy vision or an angel appearing in a puff of incense smoke to whisk you away to brunch, but alas, no. It's still dark. The chanting is still going. Your foot's asleep. And someone near you just coughed in a way that suggests they have the plague and no intention of keeping it to themselves. And yet, you're beginning to notice something odd. Something sneaky. Amidst the endless intonations and the faint but constant aroma of ancient candle wax and monk socks, there's an unspoken order to it all. An elegance. Even a rhythm. Not in the music. That's still Gregorian chant, which is less toe-tapping and more auditory wallpaper for spiritual guilt. But in the colors, you start to see how everything lines up, the chasuble, the altar cloth, the banners hanging limp on the side walls like very holy laundry. They match. Always. Because of course they do. This is the medieval church. They may not have indoor plumbing or understanding of germ theory, but by God, the vestments will coordinate. And today, it's green. Which means, yes, you've lucked out. It's ordinary time. Nothing tragic, nothing dramatic. Just a long, drawn-out spiritual slog between major events. Think of it as God's gap year. Soothing, muted green, the color of grass, hope, and quietly regretting your life choices without any major festivals to distract you. But let's not get comfortable. You didn't click on a 2-hour video titled The Role of Colors in Medieval Church Services just to learn that green is for Wednesdays. No, you came for the details. You came for the deep cuts. For the crunchy middle bits of obscure historical trivia that no one asked for but we're going to lovingly shovel into your brain anyway. So, let's take a moment to properly suffer together in the name of color theory and medieval sadness. First up, the rainbow of repression that is the liturgical calendar. The year is broken up into seasons, not spring, summer, Netflix, and pumpkin spice, like we have today, but spiritual ones. And each season comes with its own wardrobe. Let's start with Advent, because nothing says festive like 4 weeks of controlled emotional suppression. Advent is the season leading up to Christmas. You might think it's supposed to be joyful, right? Baby Jesus, angel choirs, awkward innkeeper interactions? Nope. Advent is about waiting. Patiently, quietly, and in purple. Deep, moody, melancholic purple. It's the official color of penance, because apparently nothing says the Messiah is coming like low-grade existential dread. Some churches even used blue instead of purple, because blue was associated with the Virgin Mary and also with sadness, which, incidentally, is a running theme in medieval spirituality. Then there's Christmas, the big one, the star of the liturgical show. Time to bust out the white and gold, the medieval equivalent of turning on the good chandelier. It's supposed to represent purity and light, which is slightly ironic given that most churches in December were dim, smoky, and smelled like wet chic. You don't just wear white at Christmas, though. You also wear it on Easter, the Feast of Feasts, the ultimate spiritual mic drop. He is risen. White gets wheeled out anytime something triumphant happens, Jesus being born, Jesus coming back from the dead, or when a bishop decides he feels fancy and no one tells him no. But between these great spiritual events, you spend a lot of time in ordinary time. And guess what you wear then? Green. Always green. Let's talk about that. Because at first glance, green seems kind of boring. It's not regal like purple. It's not showy like red. It's just green. But in the medieval mind, green was the color of life. Not in a modern, vegan smoothie kind of way, but in a deep, mystical, God created the world and it grew stuff kind of way. In fact, green was linked to theological ideas of regeneration and spiritual growth. Just like crops needed time to grow after planting, So did the soul need time to mature between major feasts? That's what ordinary time was for. Spiritual composting. And you, dear viewer, are the metaphorical turnip. You're welcome. Now, lest you think all this color coordination was just an aesthetic choice, I'm here to remind you that it was deadly serious. Wearing the wrong color wasn't a minor faux pas. It was borderline heresy. A priest who showed up to a martyr's feast in green instead of red would be looked at like he just farted in Latin. It was scandalous. Let's say it's Pentecost, the birthday of the church. The Holy Spirit descends, there's fire, there's wind, there's probably a dove doing interpretive dance. What color do you wear? Red. Why? Because fire, obviously. The Holy Spirit doesn't show up in beige. Red symbolizes not only fire but also blood, the divine spark, the martyr's sacrifice, and the fact that God doesn't do subtle entrances. He goes full pyrotechnic. Now picture this, a priest stumbles in wearing purple. It's not Lent. It's not Advent. It's Pentecost. That's like showing up to a 4th of July party in a Halloween costume. People notice. And not in a good way. Bishops would write strongly worded letters. Monks would gossip. The choir would probably sing passive-aggressively out of tune. Even the altar boys would give you side-eye. And don't even get me started on Lent. The 40-day spiritual boot camp where joy goes to die. Lent is purple's other time to shine. Or, well, not shine. Gloom. Brood. Lent is all about self-denial and reminding you that you're made of dust, and also that God saw your browser history and isn't mad, just disappointed. During Lent, churches stripped away as much decoration as possible. No flowers. No organ music. No fun. If there were streamers, they'd be gray. If someone smiled, a monk would probably hiss at them. It was serious. You were supposed to feel your sins. Like physically. In your knees. From all the kneeling. And during Holy Week? Oh, it gets worse. From Palm Sunday to Good Friday, the colors get dramatic. Red on Palm Sunday, because, again, joy has to bleed, and then black or bare altars by Good Friday. Black for mourning. Black for loss. Black for we crucified the Son of God, and now we have to sit in it for 3 days with no music. This wasn't just theater. It was theology. The church used color like a painter uses light, to shape your emotions, guide your experience, make you feel things whether you wanted to or not. When you walked into church, the colors told you the emotional temperature of heaven that day. Even the altar cloths, the banners, the book covers, the tabernacle veils, everything matched. Everything was part of the message. This wasn't accidental. It wasn't decorative. It was doctrine in dye. And now, let's take a blessed moment to talk about the economics of all this. Because surprise, dyes cost money. A lot of it. White was relatively easy. Bleached linen or undyed wool. Not cheap, but manageable. Green? That's where things get weird. The best medieval green dyes were made by layering yellow and blue pigments, often using woad, a stinky fermented plant paste that smelled like despair, and weld, another plant that had to be boiled and stirred for days. The result? A vibrant green, which immediately faded to a weird brownish hue the second you wore it near sunlight, rain, or time. Purple? If you wanted the good stuff, the imperial, eye-meltingly expensive Tyrian purple, you had to crush thousands of tiny sea snails. And by crush, I mean ferment their guts in vats for weeks. It was so rare and expensive that by the late Middle Ages, it was practically illegal for anyone but royalty and the highest-ranking clergy to wear it. So naturally, bishops wore it at every possible opportunity. Because who doesn't love a color that says I smell like rotten seafood, and I am very important? Red came from madder root, a slightly more pleasant process, unless you were the one stuck grinding it for hours, and kermes, a dye made from squashed insects. Fun fact, those insects had to be hand-picked off specific oak trees. By women, usually peasants, who got maybe 1 coin for a day's work and a handful of bug juice. Living the dream. Blue, the color of heaven and the Virgin Mary's wardrobe, came from indigo or woad. Indigo was imported, so it was pricey. Woad was local, but again, stank like decomposing hedgehog and made your clothes fade faster than your hope in medieval dentistry. So yeah, color was power. Color was money. Color was control. And if your parish couldn't afford it, well, too bad. Paint your cloths with wine and pretend. God would understand. Now, you may be wondering, what about the laity? The regular people? Did they get to wear all these colors too? Short answer, no. Long answer, not unless they were wealthy, clergy, or caught the attention of the Inquisition for dressing above their station. There were actual laws, called sumptuary laws, that restricted who could wear what. So if you, a humble peasant, strolled into church wearing a purple cloak, you'd either be accused of sorcery or mistaken for royalty, which were functionally the same thing in terms of outcome, burning. So instead, you wore brown, maybe gray, maybe beige. If you were lucky, you got some patched up wool that used to be green. And you watched a priest parade around in crimson and gold and reminded yourself that it was all very symbolic and spiritually edifying. And that's where we'll leave you. Still kneeling, still cold, still trying to feel God through the smell of goat sweat and incense. But now, you understand. The colors aren't just decoration. They're language, theology, power. And tomorrow? Tomorrow's a feast day, which means red. Again, sleep well. Or not. You wake up. Again. In the same church pew. Still wooden. Still unyielding. Your back is starting to form a perfect 14th century curvature, and your knees have officially filed for independence. You've lost all feeling in your left leg, and your right ear has decided Gregorian chant is its least favorite genre of all time. Congratulations. You're now spiritually aligned with the mood of the medieval church, vaguely miserable but committed to staying anyway. And wouldn't you know it, nothing's changed. Except, wait. The priest is wearing a different color today. It's not green anymore. It's gold? Or is that yellow? Hard to say, because medieval lighting isn't exactly HD. And the gold is more muddy oat milk with aspirations than Oscar red carpet. But don't worry, it's still liturgically significant. Just less shiny than advertised. And here we arrive at the golden heart of the matter. Colors in medieval church services weren't just tied to seasons and feasts. They were theological mood lighting, a complete system of emotional manipulation via textile. Like if a mood ring and a PowerPoint presentation had a religious baby. Gold, for example, was a flex. A big one. But here's the funny part, actual gold cloth was insanely rare. Because, spoiler alert, spinning metal into thread is both difficult and, expensive. So most gold vestments were either yellow silk, if you were rich, yellow wool, if you were not, or, let's say, imaginatively optimistic blends that looked like a sunset dyed of disappointment. Still, gold stood for glory, celebration, triumph. Think Christmas, Easter, and those random days where someone important got sainted. If the priest looked like he'd been dipped in celestial mustard, you knew something good had happened in heaven. Or at least something official. But don't get too used to gold. It only came out for special occasions. Most of the time, you were back to the more humble, soul-crushing colors of medieval piety. Let's revisit purple, the drama queen of the liturgical wardrobe. You already know it represents penitence and suffering. But did you know purple is also the color of spiritual awkwardness? Let me explain. During Lent and Advent, purple is the default. But there are exceptions. And what happens when you wear purple on a day that's supposed to be joyful within an otherwise grim season? You get Laetare Sunday and Gaudete Sunday, two liturgical unicorns. Days when the church says, hey, you're allowed to feel slightly less awful today. These were mid-season breaks from the gloom, a kind of spiritual halftime show where priests were allowed to wear rose. Yes, rose, as in pink. But we don't call it pink, because that sounds unserious. And heaven forbid we lose theological gravitas. So, rose vestments. Imagine the priest, normally draped in somber penitential hues, now dressed like the patron saint of subtle joy. It's like your Depression-era grandpa wearing a party hat and pretending to smile. Uncomfortable, yes, but historically accurate. Of course, rose vestments weren't mandatory. Many parishes couldn't afford them. And even if they could, most priests weren't thrilled to wear a color more associated with springtime blossoms than the fires of eternal damnation. But the church insisted. Just for that one Sunday. Just a hint of joy. Like a spiritual mint between courses of guilt. Now let's dive a little deeper into the color wheel of ecclesiastical despair. Enter black. The color of mourning, Good Friday, and funerals. You might be thinking, black is pretty straightforward. And you'd be right. It is. It's the liturgical equivalent of a power outage. A total aesthetic blackout. Which is exactly the point. Good Friday, the day we remember Jesus being tortured and executed, was stripped of all color, all music, all joy. The church would go bare. The altar cloths removed. The candles extinguished. The priest would wear black, because nothing says hope like dressing like you're attending your own funeral. And funerals? Also black. Unless, of course, the local church had run out of decent black cloth and just improvised with dark brown or gray. Because God sees the heart, not the fabric. But the gossiping villagers definitely notice when Father Thomas shows up in last year's soot-stained Lent tunic. Some monasteries, in an effort to go full emotional purge, would even dye their altar linens black for Good Friday. Which sounds cool, until you realize they had to bleach them white again for Easter. By hand. With medieval soap. Which was made of animal fat and ash. So yes, Jesus rose again, but Sister Margaret's skin didn't. Then there's red. We've touched on it already, but let's give it a proper moment. Red, the color of fire, blood, and, depending on which saint story you were reading that day, very dramatic martyrdom. Saints didn't just die. They were martyred, which in medieval terms often meant being set on fire, eaten by lions, or creatively dismembered by creatively illiterate Romans. Red vestments told you, today's saint suffered, and you should feel slightly guilty that you got bored halfway through the reading of their life story. Pentecost also got red, because the Holy Spirit arrived in flames and wind, which, for the record, sounds more like a natural disaster than a religious blessing. Still, the idea was that red equals divine action. Red meant something happened. Red was also for confirmations, which is when young medieval Christians got a gentle tap from the bishop that may or may not have turned into a slap depending on how long he'd been fasting. And what about blue, you ask? That sweet, sky-like color associated with the Virgin Mary? Blue was complicated. Technically, blue wasn't on the official Roman liturgical calendar. But that didn't stop certain regions, especially Spain, from using it anyway. Spanish churches often feature deep blue vestments for Marian feast days, which was both a theological choice and an aesthetic flex. Blue was expensive. Very expensive. Indigo had to be imported. Woad, as we've already established, smelled like compost and betrayal. So blue vestments, when they existed, were rare and precious. Which is appropriate, considering the Church's obsession with the Virgin Mary as both divine queen and intercessory mom figure. It's worth noting that while Rome eventually tightened its grip on which colors were official, local churches were doing their own thing for centuries. In Germany, for instance, some churches use gray for funerals. In Eastern Europe, green sometimes popped up for Pentecost instead of red, because hey, what's a little theological improvisation between friends? And now, because you've been such a good listener and haven't died of boredom yet, let's talk about the actual vestments themselves. You know, the garments that get dyed all these holy colors. The star of the show is the chasuble, basically a giant poncho of salvation. Originally inspired by Roman cloaks, the chasuble evolved into a large outer garment worn by priests during Massachusetts depending on the period. It could be a full circle of fabric or a stiff, awkward rectangle that made it look like the priest was smuggling a tent. Then there's the stole, a narrow strip of cloth worn around the neck and hanging down the front. It's the ecclesiastical equivalent of a necktie, except it symbolizes priestly authority instead of corporate despair. The color of the stole matched the chasuble, of course, because otherwise the Holy Spirit might get confused. You've also got the maniple, which is like a small napkin worn over the arm. It's symbolic of servitude and suffering, but mostly just made the priest look like he was about to cater a very solemn dinner party. And let's not forget the cope, a massive ceremonial cape worn during processions and other non-mass liturgies. It was the Batman cape of medieval clergy, except instead of fighting crime, you were fighting heresy, boredom, and your own back pain. All of these garments had to match the liturgical color of the day. And because dyeing fabric was expensive, most churches had a limited collection, which led to some creative solutions, like reversible vestments, two-sided stoles, or in some cases, simply slapping a colored ribbon on top of the old one and praying no one noticed. And here's a little-known fun fact for the insomniac theologians in the room. Liturgical color assignment was inconsistent for centuries. The Church didn't officially codify the modern system until the 16th century at the Council of Trent. Before that, it was liturgical chaos. Local bishops and monasteries made up their own rules. Some even assigned colors based on local herbs or saints' personal color preferences. Yes, really. Imagine showing up to church in York and seeing green for Lent, then traveling to Toledo and getting purple, then stumbling into Avignon and discovering they're using leopard print because St. Felix had a vision. The point is, it was messy, and beautiful, and deeply human. Colors weren't just symbols. They were identity, community, a visual thread connecting a peasant in a stone chapel to a bishop in a grand cathedral, to a monk scribbling sermons in candlelight, to you, sitting here now, trying to fall asleep to the sound of history and sarcasm wrapped in wool and theological fabric softener. So the next time someone tells you the medieval church was boring, just whisper softly, "Rose vestments, buddy. Rose vestments." You'll either make a new friend or start a very niche argument. And now, it's almost nightfall in our little medieval town. Vespers is approaching. The incense is being lit. The colors are changing again. But you're tired. And rightfully so. We've walked through time, through symbolism, through dye pots and candle smoke and the holy drip of ecclesiastical fashion. And we're still only beginning. Close your eyes if they aren't already. Dream of purple mist and golden processions. Sleep well, pilgrim. You wake up. Again. This time, it's not the Gregorian chanting that wakes you. It's the overwhelming stench of something. Something potent. Something that smells like a fermented goat had a heated argument with a barrel of old fish and lost. Badly. Congratulations. You've been born into the thrilling, glamorous world of medieval dye-making. Ah yes. The thing no one tells you about religious colors is that the church may have looked majestic on feast days, but behind every beautiful purple stole or glimmering red chasuble was a smell that could knock a pilgrim clean out of their sandals. And there were no scented candles to fix it. No Febreze. Just suffering. And monks. And buckets of despair. You're standing near the monastery's dye shed. And yes, it's a shed, not a factory. It's a small wooden structure with smoke curling from its chimney and fluids leaking ominously from every corner. Inside, Brother Oswald is stirring a steaming vat of what appears to be soup, but is absolutely not soup. This is where the church's most sacred colors begin, in foul-smelling cauldrons, next to latrines, in the company of very tired monks who haven't bathed since Epiphany. If you are imagining divine rays of light pouring down upon elegant looms and silent weavers whispering prayers, think again. This is ye old industrial accident, minus the labor regulations. So before we dive further into the aesthetic glory of liturgical colors, let's take a good, hard sniff at the process behind it. Because, oh, dear viewer, you have not truly known medieval suffering until you've met a monk elbow-deep in fermented woad. Let's start with the crowd favorite, purple. We already know purple was the diva of church colors, rare, prestigious, and reserved for important seasons. But do you know where that purple originally came from? Snails. Yes. Real, live snails. Specifically, the murex snail of the Mediterranean Sea. To extract the purple dye, known as Tyrian purple, you had to crack open the shell, remove a specific gland, and expose it to sunlight in a process so smelly and revolting that entire cities reeked of it for weeks. It took tens of thousands of snails to dye even a small piece of cloth. Which is why, unless you were a Byzantine emperor or a bishop with serious connections, you weren't wearing the good stuff. Instead, the church mostly relied on local alternatives, like woad, a plant that produced a blue dye which, when mixed with red, gave a sort of purplish hue. But here's the problem. Woad smells like death. Not metaphorically. Literally. To prepare woad for dyeing, you had to ferment the leaves, which meant collecting huge bundles of the plant, grinding it into a paste, and letting it rot in vats, often mixed with urine to improve fermentation. The result was a blue dye and a smell so vile it was banned within city limits in many medieval towns. People living downwind from monasteries started offering extra prayers just to avoid being reincarnated near a dye vat. And yet, this was all done in the name of sacred vestments. Now let's move to red, that fiery color of martyrdom and Pentecost passion. One of the most common sources of red dye in medieval Europe was the kermes insect, a small parasite that lived on oak trees. Harvesting kermes was a tedious process involving scraping bugs off tree bark, drying them, crushing them into powder, and then boiling them into a dye bath. It took thousands of insects to make enough dye for a single garment. So yes, That cardinal's robe? That martyr's feast a chasuble? Basically a smoothie of crushed bugs. And that wasn't even the worst part. If you didn't have access to Kermes or couldn't afford it, your red dye came from madder root, which turned out more of a dull rust color unless processed very carefully. If you weren't careful, your brilliant red vestment might fade into the exact shade of regret. But red had one advantage: it didn't usually smell like roadkill. Unlike our next contestant, yellow. Oh, yellow. So cheerful. So deceptively sunny. You'd think yellow would be easy to make. It was not. One of the richest yellow dyes came from a substance called weld, a plant that gave off a bright golden hue. Harmless enough, right? Wrong. Weld had to be boiled in giant cauldrons with lye, urine, or vinegar depending on the local recipe, and the resulting steam was so noxious that some monasteries posted warning signs. Not that anyone could read them. But the point stands. And if you were really desperate for yellow, you might use saffron, which worked beautifully, except saffron was more expensive than gold. So unless your church had royal backing or access to a spice route, your priest wasn't wearing saffron vestments unless he mugged a merchant on the road to Venice. Let's not forget green. Ah, green. The color of hope, springtime, and fabrics that never, ever stayed green for long. Green was usually made by combining blue from woad and yellow from weld or other plants. The result was often not green, more like sickly sea foam or vague algae. And because the colors weren't chemically stable, they'd fade or turn brown after a few months. Imagine celebrating the joyful rebirth of the world on Pentecost, while the priest walks out looking like he wrestled a mossy frog. And because nothing could ever be simple, the dye process was notoriously temperamental. Too much heat? The color shifts. Not enough salt? It fades. Bad water? It turns blotchy. Some monks even believed the moon phase could ruin a dye batch, which was probably just superstition. But after you've ruined your third chasuble trying to match St. Michael's sapphire eyes, you start blaming the stars. Now, imagine the church trying to keep up with all these dye needs. Vestments weren't optional. Each liturgical season required a different color, and each color had to be bold enough for the illiterate congregation to notice from the back row, which meant the monastic dye masters were under constant pressure. If the purple came out too blue, or the red too pink, or the green too swampy despair, you could expect an emergency meeting with the abbot and possibly a month's penance scrubbing privy buckets. This is how dye-making became an economic and spiritual hazard. Churches started investing in better fabrics, importing exotic dyes, even bribing merchants to donate high-quality cloth in exchange for eternal blessings. Dyers became minor celebrities or scapegoats, depending on whether the Christmas vestments came out looking like royalty or vomit. And there was competition. Yes, even among monasteries. Some Benedictine communities prided themselves on their perfect, vivid reds. The Cistercians, ever the party poopers, insisted on only the dullest, simplest colors because God loved modesty and hated flamboyance. Then you had rogue parishes who went off-book, using entirely local color schemes. In parts of Eastern Europe, brown was the vestment of choice, partly for humility, partly because it was what happened to every other color after 2 months of bad laundering. Let's pause to reflect on that for a moment. You've spent 3 weeks boiling weeds and beetles. You've dyed the stole. It looks incredible. A deep, luxurious crimson. You hang it to dry in the sun, only for a flock of pigeons to fly overhead and turn it into abstract art. Or worse, Father Richard, trying to be helpful, dumps it in a barrel of soap made from mutton fat and ashes, and now the once glorious red is a sickly pinkish tan. But do you throw it away? Of course not. This is the Middle Ages. You repurpose it as a funeral cloth or an altar drape or part of a new cope you're patching together from whatever isn't full of holes or bloodstains. Yes, even the church recycled. Not out of virtue, out of necessity. Because, spoiler, vestments were expensive. One full liturgical wardrobe could cost more than the entire village tithes for the year. That's why so many were handed down, patched, or altered. It was entirely possible you'd be attending Mass in 1347 watching your priest wear a chasuble dyed in 1273 that had been redyed 3 times and now looked like the memory of a color. But it still counted. It was still sacred. And that, dear insomniac pilgrim, is the beauty of the system. No matter how foul the smell, how faded the hue, how bug-infested the origin, these colors mattered. They gave shape to the year. They wrapped the mysteries of faith in something tangible, something visible, something human. And yes, sometimes they gave the whole village a headache from the dye fumes. But hey, that's just the price of holiness. So the next time you see a priest in a brilliant robe and think, nice outfit, remember, that outfit probably once smelled like boiled beetles and fermented goat pee. And still, it was glorious. Because behind every color was a world of labor, symbolism, and just the right amount of suffering to make it feel truly medieval. Now go ahead. Let your eyelids get heavy. Let the stench of history lull you into a gentle, dreamless sleep. You've survived the dye shed. You've seen the snails. You've smelled the despair. And that deserves rest. You wake up. Again. But this time, it's to the soft flicker of candlelight and the unmistakable sound of Father Ethelbald berating the sacristan because someone put out the wrong color vestments. Again. It's Advent, you fool, not ordinary time. Do you want to go to hell wearing green when it's clearly a purple season? You pull your scratchy wool blanket over your head and sigh. Because in the Middle Ages, it turns out, colors had deadlines. And just like modern tax season, getting them wrong could result in severe judgment, divine or otherwise. Welcome to the liturgical calendar, a year-long, color-coded religious mood ring that dictated what priests wore, when you fasted, and which saints were allowed to interrupt your scheduled misery. It was a carefully orchestrated rotation of spiritual vibes, powered by incense, guilt, and aggressively dyed fabrics. And it never stopped. No vacation. No skipping a feast day. No, we ran out of red excuses. So let's break it down. You start the liturgical year in Advent, the church's version of waiting for Christmas, without the benefit of peppermint lattes or seasonal depression memes. Advent is solemn, hopeful, and predictably colored in purple. Or violet, depending on your dye budget and your bishop's tolerance for nuance. Why purple? Because it's the color of royalty, yes, but more importantly, it's also the color of penance and brooding anticipation. You're supposed to be waiting, reflecting, preparing for the arrival of Christ by not indulging in, well, anything, except for going to Mass a lot and watching your priest wear a different shade of melancholic grape juice every week. And then, boom, December 25th hits like a liturgical sledgehammer. Welcome to Christmastide, the Church's sanctioned 2-week period of mild revelry and ecclesiastical sparkle. The vestments shift to white or gold, depending on how fancy your church is and whether your sacristy could afford cloth that didn't look like funeral linen. White symbolizes purity, divinity, and the fresh promise of baby Jesus, not to be confused with Ash Wednesday, where the ash is real and the guilt is heavier. Now, here's the thing most people forget. Christmas isn't a day. It's a season. You don't just sing one carol and move on. Oh no. You get 12 days of relentless festivity, culminating in Epiphany, where you celebrate the wise men showing up late to the nativity like the world's worst RSVP guests. Then the colors change again, and again, and again, because the liturgical year is basically spiritual color Sudoku. After Epiphany, you might get a brief period of ordinary time, which is green, the color of hope, growing things, and priests who finally wash the Advent purple out of their vestments. But don't get comfortable, because next comes Lent, and Lent is purple again, but not the same purple. No, see, Advent purple is royal, but Lenten purple is penitential. It's like wearing the same outfit to a wedding and a funeral, but somehow it's morally acceptable because the intentions are different. Lent lasts 40 days, give or take, and it's marked by fasting, prayer, and the crushing realization that you've still got 39 days left to go. The music goes quiet. The incense gets heavier. The colors get darker. Even the vestments look like they're apologizing. And if that wasn't dramatic enough, on Laetare Sunday, midway through Lent, everything suddenly switches to rose. Yes, rose. As in pink. As in the priest is now wearing what looks like an undercooked hem to signify joyful anticipation. The medieval congregation, of course, didn't always get the memo. So imagine showing up to Mass in a cloud of existential gloom, only to see Father Wulfstan walk out looking like a strawberry parfait. That's liturgical whiplash, 12th century edition. But don't laugh too hard, because next up is Holy Week. This is the Super Bowl of medieval church services. Every day has its own vibe, its own readings, and yes, its own color demands. Palm Sunday kicks it off in red, Because we're now entering martyrdom territory. Good Friday, black, or sometimes bare altar with no color at all, which is the church's version of going completely goth to mourn the crucifixion. Holy Saturday, you wait in silence, in darkness, in the creeping anticipation that someone is about to light a huge fire at the Easter Vigil and burn half the choir robes by accident. And then, Easter. White returns like a burst of heavenly light, symbolizing resurrection, purity, and the desperate hope that the choir remembered the Alleluia this time. Easter lasts 50 days, because if you had to suffer through Lent for 40, you're owed a bonus round. During this time, white or gold dominates, colors of celebration, sacred joy, and washed linen that doesn't make you feel like dying. Until Pentecost. Red comes roaring back in. Because fire. Tongues of flame. Holy Spirit descending like a medieval rave. The priest looks like a martyr. The altar is on fire. Metaphorically. Hopefully. And just when you think it's over, the church sighs deeply, rearranges the candles, and whispers, it's ordinary time again. Back to green. Back to the long, slow march through theological, whether that's not exciting enough for a special color. It's the beige of the liturgical world, even if it's technically green. But don't worry. You'll get more feast days. And more colors. Feasts of Martyrs? Red. Virgin Mary? Blue. But not everywhere. Some places still didn't approve of blue vestments until the 19th century, even though popular devotion to Mary had been exploding since the High Middle Ages. Go figure. All Saints? White. Funerals? Black, unless you're French, then maybe violet, or if you're feeling bold, white, for resurrection. Which means, on any given Sunday, the priest might be pulling vestments out of a closet that looks like the world's saddest rainbow. And each color tells the congregation, here's how you should feel today. Like a divine emotion wheel, but made of wool and bug dye. And let's not forget the saint days. There were so many saints. So many feast days. Some major, some minor. Some with relics so dubious, even the relics were asking for a second opinion. And every one of them came with their own liturgical footprint. Especially if your church was named after one. You might have a local tradition that St. Gertrude's feast day is observed in white with green accents, or St. Balthazar, the worryingly obscure, gets a custom shade of reddish-brown that no one else uses because the bishop stubbed his toe on that day in 1242. And all of it, had to be tracked, planned, and color-coordinated. Which is why, somewhere in the back room of every monastery, there was a calendar, a ledger, and at least one monk responsible for the liturgical fashion crisis board. No Google Sheets. No calendar apps. Just a huge handwritten document mapping the entire year's color rotation down to the hour. And if they got it wrong, you might get accused of heresy. No, really. There were actual theological disputes about vestment colors. Whether certain colors were too extravagant. Whether the faithful were being led astray by non-canonical dye choices. Wearing blue for Mary was a major controversy for centuries. Not because anyone hated the Virgin Mary, but because blue wasn't officially recognized in the Roman Rite until later, and some clergy saw it as devotional excess. Because, clearly, that was the problem. Not, say, the Black Death or political corruption or the fact that half the choir had fleas. So the next time you look at a liturgical calendar and think, wow, that's pretty, remember, that pretty chart was once a battleground of artistic panic, theological squabbling, and monks weeping into buckets of fermented plant mush. It was color-coded chaos with a side of salvation. And it never ended. Just like this chapter. But don't worry. You're safe now. Back under your scratchy blanket, your candle guttering low. Maybe you're drifting off to sleep, imagining a world where your biggest concern is whether your surplice is the right shade of off-white for Tuesday's minor feast of St. Mildred of Bee Stings. That's the life, really. No emails. No traffic. Just linen and obligation. Close your eyes. Let the calendar swirl past. You'll wake up tomorrow in another season. Another mood. Another sacred hue. You wake up gagging. Not because of some plague-ridden rat nibbling on your toes, though, yes, that also happened, but because someone boiled a vat of fermented mollusks 2 doors down, and now your entire self smells like the ocean died and then came back to haunt you. Congratulations. You've just discovered the process of making color in the Middle Ages. Specifically, dyeing fabric for church vestments. And no, it wasn't pretty. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even hygienic. You, dear sleeper, are now neck-deep in the medieval dye trade, a pungent, expensive, and occasionally lethal business where colors weren't just symbolic. They were a full-blown luxury conspiracy run by monks, merchants, and people who spent far too much time elbow-deep in urine. Because when it came to liturgical colors, you couldn't just order purple off Amazon. You had to make it, from scratch, with whatever nature, alchemy, and God's questionable sense of humor provided. So before you drift back into sleep, let's unravel the grotesque rainbow of how church colors were born, through mud, blood, and the tears of textile apprentices. Let's start with the diva of liturgical color, purple. That glorious, penitential, royal hue. The color of Advent, Lent, and your confessor's deeply repressed emotions. And where did it come from? Rotting snails. Yes. Specifically, the murex snail, native to the Mediterranean. These little creatures, when crushed, excreted a chemical that, after sun exposure, chemical fermentation, and days of open-air reeking, turned into Tyrian purple, one of the most valuable dyes in history. You needed thousands of snails to make a single ounce of dye. Thousands. So if your priest rolled into mass wearing rich purple robes, you weren't just seeing penance. You were witnessing economic arrogance woven into wool. And unless you were an emperor or the Vatican, you weren't getting actual Tyrian purple. Instead, you were getting lesser purples. Stuff made from plant-based dyes like madder, logwood, or woad, all of which produced murky purples that tried their best to pretend they were the real thing. But your nose knew better. Your nose always knew. Because most purple dye bats were fermented in stale urine, sometimes mixed with dung, and then simmered over a fire like the world's worst soup. Apprentices, usually teenage boys who owed the monastery some kind of karmic debt, would stir the mix for hours while gagging into their sleeves. Sleep tight knowing someone once vomited into the vat that dyed Father Godfrey's Easter chasuble. Let's move to a calmer shade, shall we? White. The color of purity, resurrection, and bleachless anxiety. White might seem like the easiest color. After all, what's more white than undyed linen, right? Except in the medieval world, undyed didn't mean clean. Linen naturally yellows, gets stained, and looks more like oatmeal than radiance. So if your priest needed something truly white for a Christmas mass or a bishop's funeral, then someone had to bleach the fabric. With urine. Again. Specifically, aged urine, known affectionately in trade circles as chamber lye, was used as a laundering agent and bleaching base. You soaked the cloth in it, beat it with wooden paddles, rinsed it in a river, if you were lucky, and prayed no one looked too closely at the final result. Nothing screams resurrection like the faint aroma of fermented peasant pea. Still awake? Good. Let's continue. Red. Blood of the martyrs. Flames of Pentecost. Bold, vibrant, and wildly expensive. Red dyes came from several sources. If you had money, you got cochineal, a deep crimson extracted from crushed insects found in the Americas. But you're medieval, so tough luck. Cochineal isn't arriving until the Spanish start exploring things they really shouldn't be. So you made do with kermes, a similar bug-based dye collected from oak trees around the Mediterranean. The bugs were painstakingly picked, dried, crushed, and used to dye wool an intense, almost luminous red. Want to know how many bugs it took to dye one garment? Too many. Enough that every red vestment basically represented a small insect genocide. There was also madderroot, which gave a more orange red and was slightly less blood of the martyrs and more someone left a tomato in the sun. It was cheaper, more accessible, and perfect for churches that wanted to honor Pentecost without spending half their yearly tithes. Now we descend into black. Not because it's nighttime, though yes, it is. But because black vestments were common for funerals, Good Friday, and certain orders of monks who believed color was for sinners. And making black cloth wasn't easy. It involved layering, dyeing the fabric blue with woad, then overdying it with red for madder, and finally finishing with tannins, sometimes derived from oak galls or even crush bark. It was complex, inconsistent, and usually faded faster than a papal indulgence at a gambling den. And don't get us started on blue. Mary's color. Soft, heavenly, and controversial. Blue wasn't always allowed liturgically. It started as a devotional preference and slowly worked its way into church acceptability, like a teenager sneaking into an adults-only club. To dye blue, You needed woad, a European plant that gave a medium indigo tone after several steps of fermentation, oxidation, and crying. Woad was affordable, which meant it was often seen as common, not good enough for sacred vestments. But then lapis lazuli entered the chat. This semi-precious stone, ground into ultramarine, produced an eye-wateringly beautiful and equally eye-wateringly expensive blue pigment, used mostly in illuminated manuscripts and altarpieces. It cost more than gold, ounce for ounce. Vestments dyed with anything resembling ultramarine were rare, elite, and usually symbolic of Mary's cosmic Instagram aesthetic, always glowing, always perfect, always just out of reach. Then came green, ordinary time's signature shade. It came from a mix of yellow and blue dyes, usually woad and weld, a plant, and rarely held its brightness for long. Medieval green was not reliable. It faded, it browned, it turned a priest into a mildew-themed saint by the end of the season. But it was accessible, and that made it useful, especially when the liturgical calendar gave you a solid 33 weeks of green in between the dramatic seasons. Which brings us to the real question. Who made all this stuff? You'd think monks, right? Sort of. Monasteries sometimes made their own dyes, especially if they had a herbarium, a working garden, or just enough poor novices to do the smelly labor. But most dyeing, especially of high-quality vestments, was done by guilds. Specialist dyers, weavers, and textile merchants formed powerful collectives in major cities like Florence, Paris, and London. They regulated trade secrets, controlled dye recipes, and set the prices high enough to make your tithe feel like a minor tax fraud. And, yes, women participated too. Many urban women, especially widows and wives of dyers, were deeply involved in the production process, often running parts of the business, mixing batches, or even designing the final embroidery. So when you see a bishop walking into cathedral mass in a robe of perfect Tyrian purple, lined with gold thread and trimmed in ermine, just know, it took at least 3,000 snails, 14 dying rodents, a teenage apprentice named Gerbert stirring a pot of pee for 36 hours, and one merchant who marked the price up 500% because your bishop was bad at budgeting. Colors weren't just symbolic. They were status. They were currency. And they smelled like trauma. You lie back, eyes drooping, dreaming of bug guts and dye vats, the gentle bubbling of the fermentation pot lulling you into a strange, colorful slumber. Your pillow smells faintly of madder root and moral ambiguity. You've learned a lot tonight, but there's still more to go. You wake up gasping. No, you're not being strangled by a ghostly monk who disapproves of your posture. You've just caught a whiff of something ripe. Like someone left a cheese wheel out in a thunderstorm, then let it ferment under a choirbay's armpit for 3 days straight. Ah, right. You're back in the 13th century. And today's topic? Medieval laundry. Specifically, how the church managed to keep its precious, heavily symbolic, outrageously expensive vestments clean in a world where soap was considered witchcraft and nobody had heard of a spin cycle. There's no Tide Pods. No washing machine. No gentle, rose-scented fabric softener. Only human misery, a bucket, and the desperate hope that God doesn't notice the mustard stain during Vespers. So, you're a sacristan. Congratulations. Your job is to take care of the church, the altar, and, most importantly, the vestments. The priests won't clean them. The bishop won't touch them. And the monks are too busy praying, copying manuscripts, or slowly losing vision in both eyes. No, it's up to you. And if you mess it up, you'll be scrubbing mildew off chalice veils until Judgment Day. Let's begin with the process. First, you haul the vestments to the lavatorium. No, not a bathroom. It's the monastery's washing station, usually a stone basin with cold running water, if you're lucky. If not, it's just a wooden tub and a whole lot of bad decisions. You drop the vestments in and instantly regret everything. Because these things aren't just dusty. They're filthy. We're talking layers of sweat, incense residue, candle wax, accidental wine spills, dried hurt from that one blessing where someone got a little too enthusiastic, and, oh yes, traces of human ashes from the funeral mass last week. Your job? Make it look holy again, without ruining it. Because if you tear the seam on a chasuble or warp the color of a cope that took 18 beetles and a monk's entire social life to dye, you're toast. So you start with soaking. Not in soap. Soap is a luxury. and half the available bars were made from animal fat, ash, and lies. Instead, you soak the vestments in lye water, a lovely blend of wood ash and water that softens dirt but also threatens to dissolve your hands if you're not careful. Wear gloves? Good joke. Your gloves are your hands. For whites, you add in a splash of aged urine. It's called chamber lye, and yes, we're back on this again. The ammonia in urine acts as a bleaching agent, meaning that faint gray chasuble might come out just a shade closer to funeral fog instead of parchment mold. You agitate the vestments with a paddle. That's a polite way of saying beat the living sin out of them. Literally. You slap and pummel the fabric until the wine stains confess. Then rinse. And rinse. And rinse again. Because one thing you don't want during Mass is the smell of week-old sheep bladder dye or that sour vintage whiff of stale pee wafting up from the deacon's dalmatic as he reads the gospel. Next, you dry. If the weather's good, you hang the vestments outside on a line made of hemp or flax. If not, you hang them inside the cloister where the sun doesn't shine and mold dreams of revenge. Now here's where it gets fun. You can't just fold the vestments like modern clothes. Oh no. Each one has a specific folding ritual, especially altar clocks and corporals, that had to be done with reverence, precision, and a complete lack of sleep. The corporal, for example, had to be folded 3 times horizontally, then 3 times vertically, into a perfect square, always with a clean side in. Why? Because that little square held the Eucharist during Mass. And if you folded it wrong, someone might think you were hosting demons instead of dinner. Mistakes weren't just oopsies. They were liturgical offenses. You could be disciplined, demoted, or even sent on a long walk into the nearest swamp to reflect on your failure with the lepers. Still not relaxed enough to sleek? Let's talk about what happens when a vestment gets irreparably nasty. Maybe the dye's bled. Maybe the embroidery's fraying. Maybe someone knocked over a censer mid-Mass, and now the whole thing smells like barbecue. Well, you can't just toss it out. This is sacred clothing. So it's ritually destroyed. That's right. Worn-out vestments were either burned in a ceremonial fire or buried, often behind the sacristy or in the monastery garden, so they could return to the earth in peace. You don't chuck the bishop's alb in a dumpster next to fish bones and rat corpses. That would be heresy. Probably. Of course, before that happened, the vestment was often repurposed. Clever sacristans might cut around the holes, stitch together salvageable pieces, and make altar cloths, banners, or linings for reliquaries. Waste not, want not, especially when every thread costs more than your annual food allowance. Want a bonus nightmare? During the Black Death, some desperate parishes reused funeral garments for multiple corpses. That's right. The same black coat that buried Brother Ignatius on Tuesday might bury Sister Mildred on Thursday. Talk about recycling. And who cleaned it between uses? Oh, you. Because apparently your life isn't hard enough. Let's not forget the seasonal rotation. Vestments had to be sorted and stored according to the liturgical calendar. So you, dear sleeper, spent hours organizing stacks of garments by color, feast day, and whether or not that one alb still smelled faintly of bishop sweat. Your tiny sacristy closet becomes a maze of boxes, trunks, and mothballs made of lavender, cloves, or, you guessed it, urine-soaked rags, because ammonia kills moth larvae. Sleep well, knowing your wardrobe smells like crime. And then there's the embroidery. Oh, the embroidery. Gold thread, silk, pearls, little relics sewn right into the seam. One mistake with your paddle, one splatter of moldy rinse water, and you're praying for divine forgiveness before the prior prays for your head on a plate. And speaking of gold, some vestments included actual gold thread known as ornu, where silk was embroidered over fine gold filaments in a technique so delicate it could take months to finish 1 square inch. And you get to launder it, with your bare hands, in a bucket, next to a goat. Let's take a deep breath here. It's easy to think of the medieval church as a place of solemn rituals, lofty incense, and reverent silence. And it was. But behind the scenes, it was chaos, sweat, and one very tired sacristan muttering Latin curses while trying to scrub beeswax out of a cope older than the cathedral itself. If you're feeling sleepy now, that's probably your brain trying to shut itself off in sympathy. But before we close this chapter, one last bit of trivia to lull you into dreams. Sometimes the laundry wasn't done at all. Yes, when things got particularly bad, war, plague, famine, your local river turning into soup, priests just kept wearing the same vestments. Over and over. Layers of wax, sweat, wine, and incense built up until the chasuble could practically walk into Mass on its own. Eventually, someone noticed. And that someone was usually you, armed with a bucket, a paddle, and the will to live. And that, dear sleeper, is how medieval laundry worked. So next time you complain about having to do your modern laundry, remember, at least you're not marinating in century-old snail juice, trying to remove a stain shaped suspiciously like St. Bartholomew. Now, close your eyes. Smell the faint trace of lavender and goat. Dream of folded corporals and the sound of paddle slaps on soggy brocade. Sleep in peace. You wake up on the stone floor of the sacristy. Again. Your head is pressed gently against a moth-eaten carpet, your neck bent at an angle that screams this posture is an invitation for a demon, and your nose is inhaling the scent of beeswax, old books, and something that might have once been bread. Or a rodent. Who's to say? The bells are ringing. It's Mass time. And you, dear sleep-deprived sacristan, are once again hurtling through the complicated ecclesiastical wardrobe that is the liturgical color system. Yes, today's nightmare? Picking out which color vestment the priest should wear. Simple? No. Picking the correct color is a holy game of roulette, but with more Latin, passive-aggressive monks, and the looming threat of heresy. Because in the grand cosmic theater of salvation, the church is color-coded, and if you mess it up, you could technically be accused of, brace yourself, liturgical confusion, which in medieval terms sits somewhere between stealing a relic and eating meat during Lent. You glance at the calendar. It's the Feast of St. Jerome. Or maybe it's the Vigil of the Martyrs. Wait, is it still ordinary time? Do we even have green copes clean? You flip through the Ordo, a kind of medieval cheat sheet that tells you what feast falls on what day and what colors you need to not be excommunicated before lunch. But even the Ordo doesn't explain why purple means both Advent and Lent, and why white is for joy unless it's for a martyr who wasn't technically beheaded, in which case red, or maybe rose. Let's unpack this soothing, sedative, priestly rainbow of chaos. White, symbol of purity, innocence, holiness, and awkwardly sweaty underarms. White is worn during Christmas, Easter, the Feast of the Virgin Mary, All Saints' Day, and for certain joyful sacraments like baptisms and weddings. It's also used for saints who were not martyrs, those blessed, lucky few who managed to get into heaven without being dismembered. So, if you're celebrating Saint Agnes of Assisi, white. St. Lawrence, who was grilled to death like a medieval hamburger. Not white. This color is a nightmare to maintain. It shows every stain, every drop of wine, every ash flake, every pollen molecule from last week's blessing of the herbs. And yet you're expected to keep it pristine. Because nothing says holy like fabric that gets dirty just by existing. Red. The color of blood, passion, martyrdom, and probably your own ruptured sanity. Used for Palm Sunday, Good Friday, Pentecost, and, of course, for feast days of martyrs, anyone who died messily for their faith. If a saint was speared, boiled, stabbed, flayed, shot with arrows, or simply exploded out of sheer righteousness, red is your go-to. It's also worn for apostles, which makes sense when you remember that most of them didn't exactly retire peacefully into a nice monastery by the sea. Red is also for the Holy Spirit, which feels a little confusing, because the Holy Spirit, being a ghost, doesn't bleed. But apparently fire imagery overrules ghost rules. The good news? Red hide stains better than white. The bad news? Dyes were expensive. To get a rich, vibrant red, you had to boil cochineal insects or use madder root or, if you're very fancy, Kermes beetles. Which means that red vestments were crawling with the memory of thousands of bugs. Delightful, right? Purple or violet if you're feeling noble. Worn during Advent and Lent, the too big please repent before the baby or the crucifixion arrives seasons. Purple is also used for penitential masses, and occasionally for funerals, depending on the century, the region, and whether the person being buried was particularly sinful or just inconveniently wealthy. Why purple? Because it was stupidly expensive to produce. The dye came from murex snails, hand-squeezed into oblivion by monks with nothing better to do than crush mollusks in the name of God. It could take 12,000 snails to make enough dye for one single chasuble, which is why purple vestments were a status symbol. They shouted, "This church is wealthy, penitent, and possibly harboring some tax evasion." Also, it looks solemn, regal, intimidating, like if a bruise went to seminary. Green, the color of ordinary time, which, despite the name, happens more than half the year and is anything but ordinary when you're the one rotating vestments every third hour. Green is worn during all those weeks that aren't feasts or fasts. The church calendar is built like this: big drama, Christmas, Easter, reflective sadness, Lent, Advent, endless Tuesdays in July where nothing happens, and Father Gerald insists on reading extra-long homilies about composting. That's green time. Green symbolizes hope, life, and the growing church, but it's also a symbol of you desperately hoping someone finally washes the alb that smells like pickled incense and guilt. Rose. Surprise. Yes, there's a rose-colored vestment. And no, it's not a romantic thing. It's used twice a year, once in Lent, once in Advent, on Laetare Sunday and Gaudete Sunday, respectively. They are the break Sundays. The "don't panic, salvation is still coming" checkpunts. Rose vestments say, "Hang in there. The fast is halfway over. You're doing great, sweetie." But here's the rub: most churches didn't own rose vestments, because rose dye was either ridiculously expensive, made with rare red and white dye blends, hideous, or just not worth the effort. So more often than not, you just get purple vestments that had faded and everyone politely pretended they were rose. It's not heresy if the lighting's bad. Now, if you're wondering how you were supposed to store all these colors and rotate them without losing your actual mind, you're not alone. Welcome to the color closet, a sacristan's hellscape. You're sorting vestments by color, obviously. Season, which changes weekly. Type, chasubles, dalmatics, copes, albs, maniples. Rank of the feast, optional, but if you get it wrong, someone will tattle to the bishop. And smell, purely for your own safety. And remember, vestments aren't just plain cloth. They're embroidered, bejeweled, stiffened with wax, and folded like origami by someone with trauma. You spend hours preparing the vestments for one mass. And then, surprise. The archdeacon announces an unplanned vigil for Saint somebody you've never heard of. And now you have to swap out everything for red, while the incense is already burning and the choir is warming up by screaming Latin. No pressure. Occasionally, the wrong color was worn, because humans are, shockingly, not perfect. And most churches only had one or two decent sets of vestments anyway. So they just used whatever was clean, or least covered in goat hair and mold. When questioned, the priest might say something like, "Yes, it's green, but spiritually it's red," and everyone would nod and go back to pretending the roof wasn't leaking onto the sanctuary. Now let's calm things down. Let your body relax into your mattress, or straw pile, or stone floor, or whatever said horizontal surface you're lying on. Let's return to the visuals of the church. Imagine the altar on a solemn winter morning. Candles flickering, breath fogging in the cold. The priest stands, wrapped in a rich purple chasuble, embroidered with gold thread and edged with velvet. Behind him, the altar is draped in matching cloths. The crucifix is veiled. The chalice gleams faintly in the morning light. It's peaceful. It's sacred. It took you 3 hours to set up, and you're probably about to pass out in a barrel of incense charcoal. But for 1 second, it all looks right. Color coordinated. Symbolic. Holy. So sleep, dear viewer. Rest your eyes. You wake up to the soft flicker of light, except it's not your bedside lamp, because this is the 13th century and electricity is just a wild idea God hasn't shared yet. No. That glow is a candle, and it's definitely dripping hot wax on your shoe. You're kneeling on a stone floor in a cold cathedral at 4:43 in the morning, half asleep, half frozen, and fully regretting every life decision that led you to become an acolyte in a parish where the only form of heating is stand closer to the altar. It's Matins, the first of the 8 canonical hours, also known as "Why is this even legal?" Your fingers are numb. Your eyes sting. And your job is to make sure the priest doesn't accidentally set his sleeve on fire during the Psalms. Welcome to the wonderful, wax-covered world of medieval church candles. These aren't your artisanal, cinnamon-scented, Pinterest aesthetic tea lights. These are medieval candles, clunky, sticky, grimy, and approximately the texture of regret that's been congealing in a cold crypt since Tuesday. They're made from tallow if you're poor and beeswax if you're fancy. Either way, they are awful to work with. Let's begin. First, tallow candles, the budget option. Tallow is rendered fat, usually from sheep or cows. And by rendered, we mean boiled down into a greasy, clumpy soup of animal sadness. The resulting wax is whitish, softish, and smells like a haunted meat locker. They also sputter. They bend when it's warm. They melt into lopsided puddles that drip onto sacred manuscripts and make choirboys cry. Worst of all, they attract rats. Because rats, like everyone else in the Middle Ages, are hungry, and tallow tastes like the high cuisine of forgotten peasant dreams. Now, if your church has a patron with actual money, you get beeswax candles. These are the Louis Vuitton of medieval lighting. Smoother, slower burning, cleaner smelling. They produce less smoke and a steadier flame, which makes reading during Mass slightly less impossible. They also cost approximately the same as a modest chicken farm, which is why they're hoarded, carefully inventoried, guarded by someone whose entire job is candle sheriff, aka the Lampidarius or Custos Candelarum. God help you if you lose a beeswax candle. Or worse, burn one on an unimportant saint's day. Yes, there's a hierarchy of candle-worthiness. Because medieval candles weren't just light, they were theology. Each candle was a symbol of Christ's light, of divine presence, of sanctity. Which is beautiful, unless you're the one who has to carry 40 pounds of flaming wax down the nave without tripping over your own tunic. Let's talk about sizes. There are the big ones, Paschal candles, used during the Easter Vigil. These can be over 6 feet tall, weighing more than a small donkey, and lit with great ceremony while everyone pretends this isn't an elaborate fire hazard waiting to happen. Then there are the altar candles, smaller, but still formidable. These are lit in symmetrical pairs. Always in pairs. Never odd numbers, unless it's some obscure votive service or someone accidentally broke one and is hoping no one notices. And of course, the processional candles, carried by shivering choirboys during feasts, solemnities, or when someone extremely dead is being wheeled in for a funeral. If it's a Marian feast, you might have blue-tinted candles, rare and stupidly expensive. If it's All Souls' Day, black candles. Yes, black candles. Not goth, just liturgical sorrow chic. Now, how do you actually make these waxy wonders? Well, unless you enjoy scalding your hands over cauldrons of molten fat and bees, you probably leave that to the chandlers. Candle making is a sacred, sticky profession. Step 1. Melt your tallow or beeswax in a huge vat that smells like boiled regret. Step 2. Dip the wicks. Again, and again, and again, 20 times or more. Step 3. Cool, hang, trim, and try not to scream as the weight of religious obligation builds a wax stalactite farm in your workshop. And then, you haul your handmade light sources into the church where they will immediately drip onto priceless stone floors, blow out in wind from a badly sealed transept window, or be devoured by a squirrel who somehow got into the vestry again. There's also lamp oil, which was cheaper and easier to store, but came with a little problem called open flames near drapery. Let's take a short walk into the daily candle routine of a medieval sacristan. You wake up. It's dark. Obviously. First, you check which services are being held. Low Mass, 1 candle, maybe 2. Solemn High Mass, 4 candles, plus incense, and possibly 1 guy with bells. Feast of St. Michael the Archangel, all the candles, plus some you stole from the baptismal font because the choir demanded mood lighting. Then you trim the wicks. Yes, wicks need trimming. If they're too long, they smoke. Too short? They drown in their own waxy pool, like tiny, flammable martyrs. Trimming is done with wick scissors, and you have to do it quietly during Massachusetts. Which sounds easy until you realize the scissors are heavy, dull, and probably from the 11th century. Now, remember, the candles must burn evenly. If they lean, you adjust. If they drip too fast, you rotate. If they go out, you cry quietly in Latin and relight them with a taper, trying not to look suspicious. By the time Vespers rolls around, you've replaced half the candles, relit the rest, and developed a soot-induced cough that smells vaguely of Easter. In Lent, you dim the lighting. In Easter, you double it. In Advent, you argue with Brother Gregory about whether purple candles are liturgically offensive or simply a fashion statement. And when a bishop visits, You light every candle in the church, including the ones you found in a box labeled "Only Used During Apocalypse." Now let's drift back. Close your eyes, if they aren't already. If they are, well done. Picture the sanctuary. The nave is quiet. The marble floor reflects flickers of gold and flame. Shadows stretch long and uncertain across the pews. Candles shimmer in the stillness, soft pools of light in an otherwise unlit world. The only sound? The faint hiss of wax dripping into ancient brass holders. The smell? A mix of beeswax, stone, damp wood, and something vaguely herbal. Maybe last week's blessed thyme is still smoldering under the altar. It's peaceful. It's sacred. It took 5 hours, 8 near fires, and a mild emotional breakdown to achieve this moment. But here it is. Stillness. Light. Holy ambience. Now, if you're wondering whether people ever stole candles, yes. Yes, they did. Candles were valuable. They could be traded, melted down, or used to sneak a midnight snack in the monastery kitchen. Which is why many churches chained their candle holders to the altar. That's right. Chained. Because nothing says piety like holy wax secured with iron links, just in case Brother Thomas gets the munchies again. And now, perhaps, as your body relaxes into soft sleep, cocooned in the glow of imaginary flame, you can appreciate the candle not as just a light source, but as a tiny, flaming warrior of faith, burning, melting, quietly defying darkness with every flicker. Sleep, listener. Let the drip, drip, drip of imaginary wax carry you gently into the darkness. You open your eyes, or maybe you just sort of halfway unglue one eyelid, from your stiff wooden pew. You're not in your memory foam bed. You are most definitely not at brunch. No one here is offering you a mimosa. Instead, you're in a massive, drafty, stone-wall cathedral in the middle of nowhere in 12th century Europe, and you've just realized something terrible. You've sat in the wrong place. Now, this may not sound like a big deal to your modern, democratic, everyone has rights, air-conditioned sensibilities, but here in the Middle Ages, you might as well have committed spiritual treason. Because where you sat during a church service didn't just reflect your spiritual devotion. Oh no, it reflected your entire place in the world. Your status, your wealth, your family lineage, how many cows your father owned, whether your grandfather married up or down, whether your uncle owed the bishop a favor or 3 pigs and a barrel of wine. In other words, medieval church seating was basically LinkedIn for peasants, and you just posted a selfie in someone else's throne. So before we get comfortable again, and don't worry, we'll get comfy in a minute, just take a second, if you're still even remotely awake, to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of history meets sarcasm sleep parade. And do let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is. There's something oddly soothing about knowing someone in Malaysia is falling asleep to medieval incense politics at the same time as someone in Toronto. Now, back to the sacred battlefield of medieval seating charts. The problem started, like all good medieval problems, with hierarchy. See, medieval society was structured like a very miserable layer cake. You had kings and nobles at the top, followed by knights, landowners, minor lords, clergy, merchants, peasants, and finally that guy who cleans the leper's latrine. And in church, this entire social salad got crammed into one building and expected to worship as equals before God. Spoiler, they absolutely did not. Sure, the priest said everyone was equal in the eyes of the Lord. But then he gestured toward the elaborately carved oak pew reserved for the local baron, complete with velvet cushion and foot warmer, and then to you, crouching on a stone bench near the door behind someone who hasn't bathed since Lent. And thus begins the medieval art of ecclesiastical seating drama. Let's take a moment to wander through the average parish church and see what your seating assignment says about your soul and your taxes. If you're a lord, congratulations. You get the best seat in the house, near the front, possibly with your family's coat of arms painted above your designated pew. Your seat is probably enclosed in some kind of wooden stall to keep the peasants from breathing near you. If you're really important, say, you fund the local abbey or your cousin is the bishop, you might even have a special chantry chapel attached to the side of the church. A private little shrine just for your dead relatives and your smugness. If you're nobility adjacent, a wealthy merchant, landholder, or maybe just someone with a good mustache, you might get a solid mid-church pew. Not near the altar, but not too close to the drafty doors either. maybe a bit of elbow room. If you're lucky, the guy next to you doesn't cough in Latin. Now, if you're a woman, things get more complicated. In many churches, seating was segregated by gender. Men on one side, women on the other. Women often sat further back unless they were nuns, abbesses, or very rich widows. And even then, they had to watch their ankles and keep their veils properly adjusted, because nothing says temptation like a flash of medieval shin. If you were a widow of means, you might be allowed a private bench, usually near the lady chapel. But if you were a young, unmarried woman, your seat was probably chosen for you based on how much temptation you radiated on a given Sunday. Now let's talk about peasants. Peasants didn't really sit. They stood. That's right, stood for hours. In drafty churches. During masses that were entirely in Latin, mostly mumbled, with a casual bell jingling to wake the faithful. There were no sermon podcasts. No cushions. No coffee. If you were lucky, you got to lean against a wall. If you were extra lucky, you found a chunk of stone that sort of functioned as a butt rest. Children, they stood too. Elderly peasants also stood, or leaned, or died upright. We're not entirely sure. There were no pews in most churches until the 14th or 15th centuries. Before that, it was a standing room only vibe, unless you were rich enough to install your own family pew, literally pay to build your own private wooden enclosure right there in church. And believe me, people did. There are entire court cases from medieval England and France about people fighting over pew rights. Actual legal documents. People were sued for sitting in the wrong place during Mass. And don't even get started on pew rents. By the 15th century, many churches started renting out pews to wealthy families. It became a kind of ecclesiastical real estate scam. You paid for a spot in the church, which guaranteed you wouldn't have to elbow your way through crowds just to see the host get lifted. If you couldn't afford pew rent, you guessed it, standing section. Maybe the porch. Maybe outside. Maybe under a tree, hoping the bell rings loud enough for you to pretend you attended. It gets better. Churches began to enforce dress codes based on where you sat. Your clothes had to match your station. Sitting near the front in a wool tunic when you could only afford linen? Scandal. Embarrassment. Possibly social death. And if you were a stranger in town, God help you. You'd be expected to wait at the back, possibly kneeling in a dim corner, hoping no one notices you don't know the words to the creed. But let's talk about the real power seats. The choir stalls. These were elaborate, wooden thrones tucked in the chancel, near the high altar. Only monks, priests, deacons, and other ecclesiastical glitterati got to sit here. They had cushions. They had carved armrests. They had little folding wooden seats called mice-rickards, which you could perch on during long services while pretending to still be standing. These mice-rickards were often carved with strange images, dragons, demons, animals playing instruments, and at least 3 naked men wrestling serpents. Because nothing says piety like a little but humor carved under your elbow rest. Above the choir stalls, canopies. Because God forbid a senior canon catch a cold during Compline. And behind them, sometimes special alcoves for the organist, the cantor, and that one guy who plays the sackbut and thinks he's better than everyone else. And then, of course, we come to the transept, or the crossing, the spot in the shape of the cruciform church where the nave and transept intersect. Sometimes people sat here. Sometimes they didn't. Mostly it was filled with processions, choirs, incense, or that weird dog that keeps sneaking in during Vespers. What about the gallery? Some churches had a second floor or balcony area, usually reserved for musicians or for noble women who needed to be visible without being seen. It's all very biblical and also vaguely Game of Thrones. Now imagine this entire seating drama. This wooden splintered battlefield of proximity and prestige, unfolding every single Sunday, every feast day, every holy day of obligation. People judging each other silently. Or not so silently. There were fights. Actual, physical brawls over who got to sit where. Someone's cousin was shoved off a pew in York in 1297 because he dared to sit in a respected man's spot. Another case in Florence involved 2 families suing each other for decades over whose pew had more inches of oak. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, someone had the idea of installing family nameplates on pews. Like early Yelp reviews, but for your lineage. And heaven help you if the bishop visited. Because then, all bets were off. Everyone got reassigned. Noble families elbowed clergy. Merchants bribed vergers. The bishop's retinue brought their own chairs. And the poor just stood in the rain and prayed for memory. And now, let us return to the present. To the soft, flickering candlelight that still glows from chapter 9. To the subtle scent of incense and damp limestone. And to your place, yes, your place, in this grand hierarchy of stone, wood, and whispering voices. You are seated. Perhaps not in the front. Perhaps not even on a real bench. But somewhere, nestled among the sleepiest of acolytes and the crankiest of widows, you are here. And here, my friend, you belong. So let the sounds of medieval seating disputes lull you deeper into rest. The shuffling of robes. The creak of ancient pews. The faint muttering of Latin insults about someone's uncle stealing their pew. Close your eyes.